Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished checking the medical supplies for the third time that morning. The forward operating base in Afghanistan buzzed with activity, but the medical tent remained her sanctuary of order amid the chaos. At 28, she had already served 2 tours as a Navy combat medic, earning respect from Marines and soldiers who initially questioned whether a petite woman from rural Texas belonged in a war zone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty compound as Sarah heard the familiar sound of helicopters approaching. Another mission was coming back, and, from the radio chatter, it wasn't good news. She quickly organized her trauma bay, knowing that in minutes, wounded soldiers would need her steady hands and calm voice. Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan burst through the tent flaps, his face grim. "Martinez, we've got incoming casualties. 3 wounded, 1 critical." Jake was the leader of SEAL Team 7, a man whose reputation preceded him. His team had been operating in the region for months, conducting high-value target operations that rarely made the news but kept everyone on the base safer. Sarah nodded, her training taking over. "How far out?" 2 minutes. Gunshot wound to the chest, possible internal bleeding. The other 2 are walking wounded. As the helicopter touched down, Sarah watched Jake's team carry their injured teammate into her tent. The wounded SEAL, barely conscious, had taken a rifle round during what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission. Sarah immediately went to work, her hands moving with practiced precision as she assessed the damage and began treatment. While she worked to stabilize the patient, she could hear Jake briefing his commanding officer outside the tent. The mission had gone sideways when their position was compromised. Someone had been feeding information to the local insurgent groups, and SEAL Team 7 had walked into a carefully planned ambush. The intel was solid, Jake was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "Someone knew exactly where we'd be and when. We lost the element of surprise, and Martinez here is the only reason Thompson is still breathing." Sarah continued her work, monitoring vital signs and coordinating with the evacuation helicopter that would take the wounded SEAL to a larger medical facility. As she cleaned and dressed the wounds of the other 2 team members, she listened to their conversation about the failed mission. "It's the 3rd time this month," one of the SEALs muttered. "Every time we get close to taking down this weapons smuggling network, they know we're coming." Sarah had heard similar conversations before. The base had been dealing with leaked intelligence for weeks, but no one could figure out where the information was coming from. What troubled her most was that American lives were being put at risk by someone they trusted. That evening, after her patients were stable and evacuated, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She walked through the quiet base, thinking about the day's events. Near the communications building, she noticed something odd. Captain David Harrison, the base intelligence officer, was having a hushed conversation with someone on a satellite phone. The conversation was in a language Sarah recognized but hadn't heard spoken on the base before. She moved closer, staying in the shadows. Harrison was speaking Pashto, one of the local languages, and he was discussing troop movements and mission timings. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what she was witnessing. Harrison was the leak. The next morning, Sarah faced a dilemma that would change everything. She couldn't simply walk up to Jake Sullivan and accuse a superior officer of treason without solid proof. Harrison had been at the base longer than anyone and was trusted by the commanding officer. But she also couldn't stand by while American soldiers died because of his betrayal. Sarah decided to gather evidence. Using her medical clearance, which gave her access to most areas of the base, she began carefully observing Harrison's activities. She noticed patterns in his behavior, timing of his communications, and, most importantly, she began documenting when missions failed in relation to Harrison's access to their details. 3 days later, Jake Sullivan approached Sarah in the medical tent. His face was troubled, and she could see the weight of leadership bearing down on him. "Martinez, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," he said, closing the tent flap behind him. Sarah's heart raced. Had Harrison noticed her watching him? "What's on your mind, sir? You've been here longer than most of my team. You see everything that goes on in this base. Have you noticed anything unusual? Anything that might explain how our missions keep getting compromised?" This was her moment. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would put her own life in danger. "Sir, I think I know who's been leaking information, but I need more proof before I can make accusations." Jake's eyes sharpened. "Tell me what you know." Sarah explained what she had witnessed, the conversations she had overheard, and the patterns she had observed. Jake listened intently, his expression growing darker with each detail. "Harrison," he said finally. "I had my suspicions, but I needed confirmation." The timing of his communications with his intelligence sources always seemed to coincide with our operational security briefings. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering their options. "We need irrefutable proof. Something that will stand up to a military tribunal. And we need to be careful. If Harrison's suspects were onto him, he could disappear or worse, accelerate his activities." They developed a plan. Sarah would continue her observations while Jake would work with a trusted member of his team to monitor Harrison's communications more closely. They agreed to meet again in 48 hours to compare notes. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the wounded SEAL she had treated, about all the soldiers who had been injured or killed because someone they trusted was selling them out. The anger burned in her chest, but she channeled it into determination. The next day brought tragic confirmation of their suspicions. Jake's team was assigned another reconnaissance mission, this time to investigate a suspected weapons cache in a village 15 kilometers from the base. The mission details were shared in a standard briefing, with Harrison present. Sarah watched from the medical tent as SEAL Team 7 prepared for departure. Something felt wrong. The usual pre-mission banter was subdued, and Jake kept glancing toward the communications building where Harrison was supposedly coordinating intelligence support. 6 hours later, the team returned under heavy fire. Their position had been compromised again, but this time they were ready for it. Jake had suspected a trap and positioned his team accordingly, turning what should have been an ambush into a tactical victory. They had captured 2 insurgents and secured valuable intelligence about the weapons smuggling network. But, more importantly, they had confirmed that Harrison was feeding information to the enemy. Jake had deliberately given Harrison false information about their extraction point, and, sure enough, that's exactly where the ambush had been set. That evening, Jake found Sarah in the medical tent. "We have him," he said quietly. "But, now comes the hard part. We need to take him down without alerting his handlers or compromising ongoing operations." Sarah realized that her role in this investigation was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. What she didn't know was that her medical training and her growing understanding of the intelligence leak would soon put her in a position she never expected to be in. As she prepared for what was to come, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since arriving at this remote base in Afghanistan. She had come here to save lives as a medic, never imagining that she would become part of an operation to stop a traitor who was costing American lives. The base settled into its nighttime routine, but Sarah knew that sleep would be elusive again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she had a feeling that her skills as a medic were about to be tested in ways she never anticipated. Outside the tent, she could hear the distant sound of helicopters and the low murmur of soldiers going about their duties. Somewhere in this base, a traitor was planning his next move, unaware that his carefully constructed deception was about to unravel. Sarah checked her medical supplies one more time, ensuring everything was in order. She had a strong feeling that tomorrow would bring casualties, but this time, she was determined that they wouldn't be American soldiers caught off guard by leaked intelligence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everyone involved. Sarah Martinez, the quiet nurse from Texas, was about to discover that sometimes saving lives required more than medical training. Sometimes it required courage, determination, and skills she never knew she possessed. The plan to expose Captain Harrison required precision and patience. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of conducting surveillance while maintaining her duties as the base medic. For 3 days, she and Jake carefully documented Harrison's activities, building a case that would be impossible to dispute. On the 4th morning, their careful planning was thrown into chaos. Sarah was inventorying medical supplies when Corporal Jenkins burst into her tent, his face pale with worry. "Ma'am, we've got a problem. Big problem." Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's team is pinned down about 12 clicks north of here. They walked into a massive ambush, and the extraction helicopter took heavy fire and had to turn back. Sarah's blood turned cold. Jake and his team were trapped, and she knew exactly why. Harrison had learned about their surveillance somehow and had set them up. This wasn't just another compromised mission, this was targeted revenge. "What's the situation?" Sarah asked, her medical training overriding her personal fears. 6 SEALs trapped in a compound, multiple casualties reported. The Taliban fighters have them surrounded, and they've got heavy weapons. Command is trying to organize a rescue mission, but it's going to take hours to get sufficient forces in position. Sarah's mind raced. Hours meant Jake and his team would likely be dead or captured by the time help arrived. She thought about the wounded SEAL she had treated just days earlier, about all the American soldiers who had died because of Harrison's betrayal. The anger that had been building inside her suddenly crystallized into cold determination. "Where's Captain Harrison?" she asked. Jenkins looked confused by the question. "He's in the command center, coordinating intelligence for the rescue operation." "Why?" Sarah realized that Harrison was probably feeding false information to the rescue teams, ensuring they would arrive too late or walk into another trap. She had to act, and she had to act now. "Jenkins, I need you to get me a full communications kit and transportation to the northern sector." "Don't ask questions, and don't tell anyone what I'm doing." "Ma'am, I can't authorize." "Corporal," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that surprised them both. "SEAL Team 7 is dying out there because someone in this base is feeding information to the enemy. If you want to save their lives, you'll help me now and ask questions later." Something in her tone convinced Jenkins. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in a Humvee racing across the Afghan desert, equipped with communications gear and her medical supplies. What she hadn't told Jenkins was that hidden among her medical equipment was something else entirely. 3 years earlier, before she became a Navy medic, Sarah had been something very different. Growing up on her family's ranch in Texas, she had learned to shoot almost before she could walk. Her father, a Marine sniper instructor, had taught her skills that went far beyond typical marksmanship. By the time she was 18, Sarah could hit targets at distances that impressed even seasoned military snipers. She had joined the Navy as a medic because she wanted to save lives, not take them. But sometimes she was beginning to understand, saving lives required different skills. Hidden in her medical kit was a disassembled M24 sniper rifle, a weapon she had quietly acquired and modified over her months at the base. She had never intended to use it, but she had kept it as insurance in a dangerous environment. Now, it might be the only thing that could save Jake's team. As the Humvee approached the coordinates where SEAL Team 7 was trapped, Sarah could hear the sound of gunfire in the distance. She ordered Jenkins to stop the vehicle 2 kilometers away from the action. "Ma'am, we can't get any closer. The Taliban has the whole area locked down." Sarah grabbed her equipment and started moving toward the sound of gunfire. "Stay here and monitor communications. If you don't hear from me in 2 hours, report my position to command." "But, ma'am, that's an order, Corporal." Sarah moved through the rocky terrain with surprising stealth, her medical training having taught her to move quietly and efficiently. As she got closer to the combat zone, she could see the tactical situation clearly. Jake's team was trapped in a small compound, surrounded by at least 30 Taliban fighters positioned in the surrounding hills. The SEALs had taken casualties and were running low on ammunition. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see Jake coordinating his team's defense, but they were clearly outnumbered and outgunned. The Taliban fighters were methodically closing in, knowing that time was on their side. Sarah found a position on a ridge overlooking the battlefield and began assembling her rifle. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over as she prepared the weapon. Through the scope, she could see individual Taliban fighters, their faces focused on the task of killing American soldiers. This was not how she had imagined using her shooting skills. Every instinct she had developed as a medic screamed against what she was about to do. But Jake's team was going to die if someone didn't act, and she was the only person in position to help them. Sarah's first shot took down a Taliban fighter who was positioning an RPG to destroy the building where the SEALs were trapped. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the hills, causing confusion among the enemy fighters who couldn't immediately identify where the shot had come from. Her second shot eliminated a machine gunner who had been keeping Jake's team pinned down. Suddenly, the SEALs had an opportunity to move and reposition themselves. Over her radio, Sarah heard Jake's voice, "Unknown friendly, this is SEAL Team 7. Can you identify yourself?" "Jake, it's Sarah. I'm providing overwatch from the northern ridge." There was a moment of stunned silence before Jake responded. "Martinez? What the hell are you doing out here?" "Saving your lives," Sarah replied, taking her third shot and watching another Taliban fighter fall. "Harrison set you up. He's been feeding intelligence to the enemy, and he knew about our investigation." As Sarah continued to provide covering fire, Jake's team was able to break out of their trapped position and begin fighting their way toward an extraction point. But the Taliban fighters were beginning to zero in on Sarah's position, and she found herself under increasing fire. "Sarah, you need to get out of there," Jake's voice crackled over the radio. "They've spotted you." "Negative," Sarah replied, adjusting her position as bullets struck the rocks around her. "You need to reach the extraction point. I'll keep them busy." What happened next would become legend among the special operations community. For 45 minutes, a Navy medic with a sniper rifle held off 30 Taliban fighters while SEAL Team 7 fought their way to safety. Sarah's precise shooting and tactical positioning prevented the enemy from overrunning Jake's position and bought enough time for a rescue helicopter to reach them. By the time the fighting was over, Sarah had eliminated 12 enemy fighters and wounded several others. More importantly, all 6 members of SEAL Team 7 were alive, though several required immediate medical attention. As the rescue helicopter lifted off with Jake's team, Sarah found herself alone on the ridge, surrounded by the aftermath of the battle. Her medical training immediately reasserted itself as she began thinking about the wounded SEALs and what treatment they would need. But she also realized that her actions had changed everything. She was no longer just a medic, she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The woman who had spent her career saving lives had just taken several, and the emotional weight of that decision was beginning to settle on her shoulders. The ride back to the base was quiet. Jenkins kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, clearly trying to process what had just happened. Sarah sat in silence, her rifle once again disassembled and hidden among her medical supplies. When they arrived at the base, Sarah immediately went to work treating the wounded SEALs. Jake had taken shrapnel to his left arm, and 2 other team members had gunshot wounds that required immediate attention. As she worked on their injuries, she could see the questions in their eyes, but no one spoke about what had happened on that ridge. It wasn't until later that evening, after all her patients were stable, that Jake finally approached her in the medical tent. "Martinez," he said quietly, "we need to talk." Sarah looked up from her medical charts. "About Harrison?" "About everything. What you did out there, that wasn't typical medic training." Sarah sat down heavily, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up with her. "My father was a Marine sniper instructor. I grew up on a ranch in Texas. I've been shooting since I was 8 years old." Jake nodded slowly. "And you became a medic because?" "Because I wanted to save lives, not take them." Sarah's voice was quiet, reflective. "But sometimes saving lives means doing things you never thought you'd have to do." Jake sat down across from her. "What you did today saved my entire team. But it also means you can't go back to just being a medic. Command is going to have questions, and Harrison is still out there." Sarah had been thinking the same thing. Her actions had saved Jake's team, but they had also exposed her as much more than a simple medic. Harrison would realize that his activities had been discovered, and he would likely try to eliminate the witnesses. "What happens now?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, considering their options. "Now we finish what we started. We take down Harrison and his network. But we do it right this time, and we do it together." Outside the medical tent, the base continued its nighttime routine, unaware that the dynamic between the quiet medic and the SEAL team leader had fundamentally changed. Sarah Martinez was no longer just a nurse who happened to be serving in Afghanistan. She had become something else entirely, something that would be needed for the challenges ahead. The base felt different the next morning. Word of the rescue operation had spread, though the details remained classified. Sarah noticed the way other soldiers looked at her now, a mixture of curiosity and respect that made her uncomfortable. She had spent her military career being underestimated, and, in many ways, she preferred it that way. Captain Harrison appeared in the medical tent shortly after breakfast, his face showing concern that Sarah now recognized as completely fake. "Martinez, I heard about yesterday's operation. Quite heroic of you to provide medical support in such a dangerous situation," Harrison said, his eyes searching her face for any sign of suspicion. "Just doing my job, sir," Sarah replied, keeping her voice neutral while continuing to organize medical supplies. "Of course. I'm just glad everyone made it back safely. These Taliban fighters are getting more sophisticated in their tactics. It's almost like they know our operational procedures." Sarah felt a chill at his words. Harrison was fishing, trying to determine how much she knew about his activities. She realized this conversation was a test, and her response could determine whether she lived or died. "The enemy adapts, sir. That's why we have to stay one step ahead," she said, meeting his gaze directly. Harrison studied her for another moment before nodding. "Indeed. Well, carry on with your duties. I'm sure we'll have more casualties to deal with soon." After he left, Sarah felt the weight of the threat hanging over her. Harrison suspected something, and she knew he would act soon to protect himself. She needed to accelerate their plan to expose him before he could strike first. That afternoon, Jake summoned Sarah to a secure briefing room where she met the rest of SEAL Team 7 for the first time in a formal setting. The 5 SEALs looked at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. She was no longer just the medic who patched them up, she was the woman who had saved their lives with skills they never knew she possessed. "Gentlemen," Jake began, "Martinez is now part of this operation. What she did yesterday proves she's capable of more than medical support." Petty Officer Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, spoke first. "Ma'am, what you did out there was incredible. But we need to know what we're working with. Jake says you have sniper training?" Sarah looked around the room at these elite warriors who were now asking for her help. "My father trained Marine snipers for 20 years. I grew up learning everything he could teach me. Before I joined the Navy, I was competing in long-range shooting competitions." "Why medical?" asked Chief Petty Officer Thompson, the SEAL she had treated on her first day. "Because I wanted to save lives, not take them. But yesterday showed me that sometimes those goals aren't mutually exclusive." Jake pulled up a map of the region on a tablet. "Here's what we know. Harrison has been passing intelligence to a Taliban commander named Rashid Ahmadi. Ahmadi runs weapons and coordinates attacks against coalition forces. Our mission is to capture Harrison in the act and take down Ahmadi's network." "What's the plan?" Sarah asked. "We're going to feed Harrison false information about a high-value target operation. When he passes that intelligence to Ahmadi, we'll be waiting. But, this time, instead of walking into an ambush, we'll be the ones setting the trap." Rodriguez pulled up surveillance photos on his laptop. "Ahmadi operates out of a compound about 20 miles northwest of here. It's heavily fortified, and he's got at least 50 fighters under his command." Sarah studied the photos, her tactical mind analyzing the terrain and defensive positions. "What's my role in this?" Jake looked at her seriously. "We need someone who can provide long-range support and medical expertise. You've proven you can do both." Over the next 2 days, they planned the operation in detail. Sarah found herself contributing insights that surprised even her. Her medical training had given her a unique understanding of human physiology that translated into tactical advantages. She knew exactly where to place shots for maximum effectiveness, and her experience treating combat wounds gave her insights into enemy defensive positions. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Jake would brief Harrison on a fictional operation to capture a high-value Taliban commander. The operation would supposedly take place at a compound that was actually empty but positioned to look like a legitimate target. When Harrison passed this information to Ahmadi, the Taliban commander would likely move his forces to intercept the American team. What Ahmadi wouldn't know was that SEAL Team 7 would be waiting at his real compound, ready to strike when his forces were deployed elsewhere. Sarah's role was crucial. She would position herself on a ridge overlooking Ahmadi's compound, providing overwatch and eliminating key targets when the assault began. Her medical training would also be essential for treating any wounded team members during the operation. 2 nights before the mission, Sarah couldn't sleep. She found herself walking through the quiet base, thinking about how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had come to Afghanistan as a medic, focused on healing and helping others. Now she was preparing to participate in a combat operation that would likely result in multiple casualties. Near the communications building, she noticed a light on in Harrison's office. Through the window, she could see him on the satellite phone, speaking in hushed tones. Sarah moved closer, staying in the shadows as she had learned to do. Harrison was speaking in Pashto again, and Sarah could make out enough to understand that he was discussing American troop movements and operational timing. But what chilled her most was what she heard next. "The medic is becoming a problem," Harrison was saying. "She knows too much, and Sullivan trusts her completely. She needs to be eliminated during the next operation." Sarah's blood ran cold. Harrison wasn't just planning to compromise their mission, he was specifically targeting her for assassination. She realized that participating in the upcoming operation would be signing her own death warrant unless they modified their plan. She quietly moved away from the building and went directly to Jake's quarters. When she explained what she had overheard, Jake's expression turned grim. "He knows we're onto him," Jake said. "This changes everything. We can't proceed with the original plan." "Actually," Sarah said, an idea forming in her mind, "maybe we can. But we need to turn the tables completely." Over the next hour, Sarah and Jake developed a new plan that was far more dangerous but offered the possibility of ending Harrison's betrayal permanently. Instead of trying to catch him in the act of passing information, they would feed him intelligence that would draw him into the field where they could confront him directly. The modified plan required Sarah to take on an even more active role. She would accompany Jake's team on a supposedly routine patrol, with Harrison coordinating their movements from a forward observation post. When Harrison attempted to eliminate Sarah during the operation, they would capture him and force him to reveal his entire network. It was a plan that required perfect timing and complete trust between team members. Sarah would essentially be using herself as bait to draw out a traitor who had already ordered her death. As she prepared for what could be her final mission, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about her father's training, about the wounded soldiers she had treated, and about the choice between saving lives and taking them. She realized that her medical oath to do no harm had evolved into something more complex. Sometimes preventing harm to the innocent required harming those who threatened them. It was a philosophical challenge she never expected to face, but one that seemed increasingly clear as she prepared for the mission ahead. The night before the operation, Jake found Sarah in the medical tent, methodically checking and rechecking her equipment. "You don't have to do this, Martinez," he said quietly. "We can find another way." Sarah looked up from her rifle, which she was cleaning with the same precision she applied to medical procedures. "Yes, I do. Harrison has already ordered my death, and he's going to keep getting American soldiers killed until someone stops him. If I don't do this, who will?" Jake nodded, recognizing the determination in her voice. "You know this could go wrong in 100 different ways." "So could surgery," Sarah replied. "But sometimes you have to take calculated risks to save lives." As she finished preparing her equipment, Sarah realized that tomorrow would determine not just whether she survived, but what kind of person she would be for the rest of her life. The quiet medic from Texas was about to face her greatest test, one that would require every skill she had learned both as a healer and as a warrior. Outside the tent, the base settled into its nighttime routine, unaware that one of the most dangerous operations in the unit's history was about to begin. Sarah Martinez checked her medical supplies one final time, then turned her attention to the weapon that would either save her life or end it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everyone involved and determine the fate of countless future operations. Tomorrow, the SEALs would discover just how far their medic was willing to go to protect her teammates and stop a traitor who had been hiding in their midst. The morning of the operation dawned clear and cold. Sarah had barely slept, but her mind was sharp and focused as she made final preparations. The plan was set in motion when Jake briefed Harrison on their supposed mission to investigate Taliban activity in a remote valley. "We'll establish an observation post on the northern ridge," Jake explained to Harrison, pointing to locations on a tactical map. "Martinez will provide medical support from a concealed position while we conduct reconnaissance." Harrison studied the map with the focused attention of someone planning an assassination. "I can coordinate air support from this position," he said, indicating a location that would give him clear lines of sight to where Sarah would be positioned. "Perfect," Jake replied, though Sarah could see the tension in his jaw. "We'll maintain radio contact throughout the operation." 2 hours later, SEAL Team 7 departed the base in 2 vehicles, with Harrison following in a separate Humvee equipped with communications gear. Sarah rode with Jake's team, her medical equipment secured alongside her carefully concealed sniper rifle. As they drove toward their destination, Sarah felt the weight of what was about to happen. She was essentially walking into her own execution, trusting that Jake and his team could protect her when Harrison made his move. "Remember," Jake said quietly over the team radio, "Harrison will try to eliminate Martinez during the operation. When he makes his move, we take him alive. We need him to expose his entire network." The convoy reached the target area and deployed according to plan. Sarah moved to her assigned position on the northern ridge, establishing both a medical station and a concealed shooting position. Through her rifle scope, she could see Harrison setting up his equipment on a neighboring ridge, ostensibly to coordinate air support but actually to position himself for an assassination shot. For 3 hours, they maintained the pretense of a routine reconnaissance mission. Jake's team reported fictional observations while Sarah provided medical support that wasn't needed. But, all the while, she was watching Harrison through her scope, waiting for him to reveal his true intentions. The moment came just after noon. Sarah saw Harrison adjust his position and raise what appeared to be a sniper rifle of his own. Through her scope, she could see him taking aim directly at her position. "Contact," she whispered into her radio. "Harrison is in position to take the shot." "Hold your position, Martinez," Jake's voice came back. "Let him commit to the action." Sarah watched as Harrison settled into a shooting position, clearly preparing to fire. This was the moment of truth, the final confirmation that he was willing to murder an American service member to protect his treasonous activities. But Harrison hesitated, perhaps sensing that something was wrong. Sarah realized that he suspected a trap, and if he withdrew now, they would lose their chance to capture him with clear evidence of his betrayal. Making a split-second decision that would haunt her for years to come, Sarah deliberately exposed herself to Harrison's line of fire. She stood up from her concealed position, giving him a clear target while keeping her own rifle trained on him. Harrison took the bait. Sarah saw the muzzle flash from his rifle and felt the bullet pass close enough to her head that she could hear its passage. At the same moment, she squeezed her own trigger. Her shot struck Harrison in the shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him to the ground but leaving him alive as planned. Jake's team immediately moved to secure Harrison while Sarah provided overwatch, ensuring no other threats emerged. When they reached Harrison's position, they found not just the evidence of his assassination attempt, but a treasure trove of intelligence about his entire network. His communications equipment contained records of conversations with Taliban commanders, detailed information about American operations, and, most importantly, evidence of a broader conspiracy that extended beyond just one traitor. As Sarah treated Harrison's gunshot wound, applying the same professional medical care she would give to any patient, she could see the hatred in his eyes. "You have no idea what you've done," Harrison said through gritted teeth. "This war is bigger than you understand. American lives don't matter to the people making these decisions." "American lives matter to me," Sarah replied, continuing to work on his wound. "That's why you're going to survive to face trial for what you've done." The helicopter extraction arrived 20 minutes later, and Harrison was transported back to the base under heavy guard. But the operation was far from over. The intelligence they had gathered revealed a network of corruption and betrayal that extended to multiple bases and involved several high-ranking officers. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself working closely with military intelligence officers and FBI agents as they unraveled the conspiracy. Her unique position as both a medical professional and a combat effective operator made her invaluable to the investigation. The network that Harrison had been part of was larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. It involved not just intelligence leaks, but weapons smuggling, drug trafficking, and the systematic betrayal of American operations throughout Afghanistan. Sarah's testimony and the evidence she had helped gather led to the arrest of 12 military personnel and numerous civilian contractors. The weapons smuggling network that had been responsible for countless American casualties was completely dismantled. But the personal cost to Sarah was significant. The events had transformed her from a medic focused on healing into someone who had been forced to take lives and confront the darkest aspects of human nature. She struggled with the psychological impact of her actions, even though she knew they had been necessary. 3 months after Harrison's capture, Sarah received orders transferring her to a new assignment. She was being moved to a special operations medical unit where her unique combination of skills would be put to use training other medical personnel in advanced combat techniques. On her last day at the forward operating base, Jake Sullivan found her in the medical tent, packing up her equipment. "Martinez," he said, "I wanted to thank you for everything you did. You saved my entire team, and you helped expose a conspiracy that was getting Americans killed." Sarah looked up from her packing. "I was just doing my job." "No," Jake said firmly, "you were doing much more than that. You could have stayed safe in this tent, treating wounded soldiers and staying out of the fight. Instead, you risked everything to protect your teammates." Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened. "I joined the Navy to save lives. I thought that meant I would only be using my medical training. But I learned that sometimes saving lives requires different skills." Jake nodded. "The teams you'll be training are lucky to have you. They're going to learn from someone who understands what it really means to serve." As Sarah prepared to leave Afghanistan, she reflected on how much she had changed during her deployment. She had arrived as a medic who happened to have exceptional shooting skills. She was leaving as someone who understood that protecting American lives sometimes required taking difficult actions and making painful choices. The young woman from rural Texas who had joined the Navy to heal people had discovered that healing and protecting sometimes required the same person to do very different things. She had learned to balance her medical oath to do no harm with the reality that sometimes preventing harm to the innocent required harming those who threatened them. Years later, Sarah Martinez would become a legend in special operations medical training. Stories of the nurse who could shoot would inspire a generation of combat medics who understood that their role extended beyond treating wounded soldiers to actively protecting them. She never spoke publicly about the details of what happened in Afghanistan, but those who served with her knew that she had proven something important, that courage, skill, and dedication could be found in unexpected places, and that sometimes the most effective warriors were those who were primarily motivated by a desire to protect and heal others. The transformation of Sarah Martinez from a quiet medic to a combat-effective operator who helped expose a major conspiracy became a case study in military training programs. Her story demonstrated that traditional assumptions about roles and capabilities could be limiting, and that the most valuable service members were often those who could adapt and excel in multiple areas. But, for Sarah herself, the most important outcome was simpler: she had kept her promise to save lives, even when that required her to do things she never thought she would have to do. In the end, that was what mattered most to the woman who had started as just a nurse and ended up changing everything. The base in Afghanistan continued its mission long after Sarah's departure, but the soldiers who served there never forgot the story of the medic who had saved SEAL Team 7 and exposed a traitor. Her legacy lived on in the increased security measures, the improved intelligence protocols, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important contributions came from unexpected sources. Sarah Martinez had proven that dedication, skill, and courage could transform anyone into something more than they thought possible. She had shown that sometimes the most effective way to save lives was to be ready to fight for them, and that true service meant being willing to do whatever was necessary to protect those who depended on you.